Move this garbage. The punk snapped as he kicked over the framed photo resting atop the coffin, the glass shattering on the gravel, while flower petals scattered like scraps in the wind. No one moved. No one dared speak. He stepped forward, boots crunching through the broken glass, without blinking, like he owned the ground beneath him. People like you don't get funerals here. What he didn't know was that the man he just humiliated wasn't some broke nobody in mourning. He was the black CEO who used to run this city, and by sundown, that punk would be begging on his knees. It was supposed to be a quiet morning. The sky over Northgate Cemetery hung low with a pale, steely haze, the kind that muted color and sound. Gravel crunched under slow, steady footsteps as a small group gathered near two modest coffins, one draped in faded navy, the other in deep burgundy velvet. The man at the center stood alone. Black suit, no tie, chin raised, shoulders squared. His name was Jalen Morris. To most here, he was just a grieving son and brother. But a few old enough to remember, glanced once and whispered. He hadn't been seen publicly in over 8 years. And now, he stood between the dead and the living, hands gripping both coffins, knuckles bone white. One held the body of his mother. The other, his younger brother. He didn't shed a tear. He hadn't since the day they were taken. Today, he came to bury them. Not to beg, not to explain, just to bury them. They showed up without warning. 5 of them. Loud, careless, laughing like it was just another day to mark territory. The one in front wore a bomber jacket 2 sizes too big, sleeves dragging over his wrists, face cocky like he owned the whole block. His name was Bosley Trent, or, as the streets called him, Bo. He didn't recognize Jalen, at least not yet. To him, this was just another powerless man trying to hold on to something that didn't belong. He tossed his cigarette near the casket, then stepped on it like it was just another mess in his way. Didn't nobody give you permission to hold a funeral here? He sneered, staring straight at Jalen. This land belongs to the East Side boys now. One of the punks behind him let out a snort. Another grabbed a folding chair and flipped it open like he was getting ready to watch a show. They weren't here to grieve. They were here to humiliate. Jalen didn't move. He didn't flinch when Bo's boot scraped the edge of his brother's casket, or when another punk flicked ash dangerously close to his mother's flowers. He just stood there, both hands still locked on the wood, like his grip alone could keep them safe. One of the older mourners tried to step in, a wiry man with silver hair and a limp in his walk. Please, he said quietly, we're just trying to bury family. This isn't your fight. Bo turned, grinning. You think I care about your dead? He stepped closer, eyes scanning Jalen like he was measuring weakness. You should have buried them in a ditch. That's all they deserved. Another voice from the punks added, especially the brother. Heard he ran his mouth to the wrong people. Jalen's jaw clenched, just once. Still, he said nothing, but something cold shifted in his eyes. And Bo, for a split second, seemed to notice. You deaf or just slow? Bo barked, stepping even closer now, his breath foul with cheap gin. I said, get this mess out of here. Then, without warning, he leaned in and shoved Jalen hard in the chest. The force jolted through him, but Jalen didn't stumble. His feet held firm. He looked down at the scuff now smeared across his jacket. His only suit, the one he hadn't worn since the courtroom. Slowly, he raised his eyes. Not fast, not angry, just steady, quiet. Don't touch the caskets, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the morning air. For a moment, no one responded. Then Bo laughed, too loud, too fast. You got some nerve for a nobody. He looked around, smug. You lot know who I am, right? He didn't wait for an answer. Bo Trent, East Side enforcer. This street? Ours now. But Jalen was no longer looking at Bo. He was looking past him, toward the black SUV that had just turned onto the gravel path, crawling forward without a sound. The SUV stopped. Its windows were tinted, engine still humming low like a warning just beneath the surface. Bo barely glanced at it. What now? He scoffed. You called your lawyer? One of his crew chuckled, but no one moved closer. Something about the car, its silence, its timing, made the laughter stick. Jalen didn't answer. He gently placed both hands back on the casket handles. "This is my mother," he said quietly, "and my brother. I'm going to carry them to their resting place." Bo stepped forward again, annoyed. "Not through this street, you're not." But before he could reach him, the SUV door opened. A man stepped out, all black, no words, just presence. And in that moment, the temperature dropped. Bo's smirk faltered. His crew shifted. Jalen didn't look back. He didn't need to. That voice in his head, low, familiar, just said one thing. "You bury them. I'll handle the rest." Bo's shoulders straightened as the man in black stepped onto the gravel, his boots soundless but deliberate. He didn't say a word. Didn't need to. His eyes scanned the scene. The coffins, the flowers, the broken glass near Jalen's feet, and then landed squarely on Bo. There was no anger, no drama. Just a quiet authority that made the air feel heavier. Bo raised his chin, trying to reclaim the moment. "You lost, old man," he snapped. "This is East Side territory." The man didn't blink. He walked forward until the space between them was nothing, then stopped. Slowly, he reached into his coat. Bo stiffened. His crew did too. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out something far simpler. A black leather wallet. He opened it with one hand, turned it toward Bo, and that was when everything shifted. It wasn't money. It was a badge. No police symbol. No agency name. Just a silver crest embossed with 3 letters. ZTC. Bo blinked. "What the hell is ZC?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. But no one answered. The man in black closed the wallet, slid it back into his coat, and said calmly, "Step away from the caskets." Bo laughed, but it was forced now. "You think you can walk in here, flash some made-up badge, and bark orders at me?" His voice cracked. "You've got no idea who I am." The man tilted his head, almost curious. "You're right," he said flatly. "I don't." Then his gaze shifted, just slightly, to Jalen. "You good?" Jalen gave the faintest nod. No words exchanged. No details needed. And somehow, that made it worse. Because Bo saw it. The respect. The deference. The silent chain of command that didn't need to be spoken out loud. And for the first time since he swaggered onto that cemetery path, Bo felt something he hadn't expected. He felt out of place. "I don't care who you are," Bo barked, voice louder now, sharper, trying to sound bigger than he felt. "This is our turf. You don't get to come in here and play cop." His crew started murmuring, shifting behind him, unsure. Jalen stayed silent. He was still holding the caskets, still the grieving son, still the man in black, but somehow now he felt like the one in charge. The man with the ZC badge stepped forward again, just one pace, but it felt like 10. "Last warning," he said, voice low and even. "Back off, or I make you." Bo flinched, barely, then shoved past. "Let's see you try." That's what happened. A hand shot out, not Jalen's, but the agent's. Fast, controlled, and precise. He grabbed Bo by the collar, spun him around, and slammed him face first into the hood of the black SUV with one clean motion. No yelling, no wasted energy, just silence. Broken by the sharp breath, Bo gasped as metal met cheekbone. Bo struggled, but the agent didn't even raise his voice. "Hands where I can see them," he said, pressing just hard enough to make it clear this wasn't a bluff. The rest of Bo's crew froze. One of them took a step back. Another dropped the cigarette he hadn't even lit. No one moved to help. No one dared. Jalen finally spoke, voice steady, eyes fixed straight ahead. "I told you not to touch the caskets." Bo grunted, face still pressed to metal, ego leaking onto the hood with every second. Who is he?" spat. Jalen didn't answer, but the agent did. "Someone you should have stayed far away from." Then, without warning, he let Bo go. The enforcers stumbled back, off balance, humiliated, surrounded by silence. Jalen stepped forward and lifted the coffins again, one in each hand, shoulders square. No words, no threat, just to walk forward, slow and unshaken. And not a single punk dared block his path. Jalen walked the gravel path alone, Coffins steady in his grip, each step pressing into memory. He didn't look back. Not at the punks who now stood frozen in shame. Not at the man in black who watched silently near the SUV. His eyes were fixed forward, on the hill, on the graves, on the promise he'd made. Behind him, the silence wasn't just fear. It was recognition. Something in the way he moved. The posture, the calm. One of Bo's crew, a lean kid with twitchy hands and too many nights on the street, leaned toward the others. "Wait, that guy," he whispered. "Wasn't he the one from the Langston merger story?" Another nodded, slower. Jalen Morris, the finance guy who vanished. The name rippled like static through the group. Some didn't know it. Others knew too well. Langston Holdings, the Zerani Group, the $8 billion scandal no one could trace. Until now. And suddenly, the pieces didn't just fall. They snapped into place. Back near the SUV, the man in black stood quietly, now speaking into a small earpiece tucked beneath his collar. "Subject has resumed motion. Ceremony in progress. Maintain zero interference unless target breaches protocol." His tone was clinical, neutral, but his eyes never left Jalen. A second vehicle, unmarked but armored, had parked 2 blocks down and was barely visible through the iron gates. Inside sat 2 more men, one reading off facial recognition scans, the other tracking movement patterns from the drone circling overhead. This wasn't just security. It was surveillance, precision, containment, because Jalen Morris wasn't merely returning for a funeral. He was being watched by investors, by enemies, and by the same people who once buried his story like it was a threat to the entire system. 8 years ago, he walked into a courtroom and didn't walk back out. But no one, not Langston, not the board, not the press, ever truly understood why. Today, someone would. Clarice Morris used to wear pearls to church. Every Sunday, rain or shine, she'd stand at the front steps of Maple Hill Baptist with a fresh pressed skirt, her chin high, and her son beside her in shoes that never quite fit. She raised Jalen with dignity, even when money ran dry, even when the mortgage notices came faster than the bills could be paid. His younger brother, Darius, had a sharper edge, less patient, more fire, but Clarice kept them both grounded. She worked nights as a hospital custodian and spent her weekends tutoring kids in the community center, refusing every handout. She didn't just believe in self-respect. She lived it. That was why, when the Langston scandal broke and Jalen was arrested, she didn't cry in public, didn't speak to the press. She just closed the curtains, lit a candle, and waited. Waited for a son she believed would one day return, not in shame, but in silence. And now here he was, carrying her home. Across the street, a black Bentley pulled up beside the curb. Its windows didn't roll down. Its doors didn't open. But those who mattered knew exactly who was inside. Edward Langston never showed up to funerals, not even his own father's. But today, for reasons known only to a handful, he was here, watching from behind polarized glass. His driver said nothing. His assistant didn't blink. Edward's eyes were locked on the man walking alone up the gravel hill. 2 coffins in his grip, no crowd, no fanfare. "He shouldn't be back," Langston murmured. His voice was low, tight, controlled. "And yet here he is." The assistant cleared his throat. "Board said to observe." Nothing more. Langston nodded once, but his fingers drummed against the leather armrest. It wasn't fear, not yet, but something colder, calculation. He'd buried men with more money than Jalen Morris. But this one walked like he'd already won. The last time Jalen's name made headlines, it wasn't in praise. It was scandal, front page fury, stock crash in bold letters. They said he embezzled, that he falsified filings, that he orchestrated a backdoor takeover of Zerani's West Africa pipeline investment. What they didn't say, what no reporter dared dig into, was why the audit trails disappeared the same week Langston Holdings quietly acquired 6 of Jalen's original patents, or why the SEC investigation closed abruptly without trial, citing insufficient evidence after 3 sealed testimonies. Jalen never defended himself. Not once. He let the world believe he broke. Let them smear his name and bury his future. But behind closed doors, something else happened. Something deeper than corporate betrayal. Someone got scared. Not because Jalen was guilty, but because they realized too late he was smarter than all of them. And now, after 8 years of silence, he was walking through their city like a storm that had been waiting for permission. Atop the hill, Jalen paused. The coffins rested beside the freshly dug earth, and for a long moment, he just stood there, silent, unmoving, as if the entire city was holding its breath with him. Down below, the black SUV remained parked, engines still idling. Across the street, the Bentley eased back into motion, disappearing around the corner like it had never been there. But for those paying attention, the message was clear. Something had shifted. Not loud, not flashy, but irreversible. Jalen didn't need to announce his return. He didn't need cameras or headlines. His presence alone was enough to send boardrooms whispering and old enemies double-checking their exit plans. A crow landed nearby, black wings against pale sky, watching him like it knew. Jalen exhaled once, and then, in a voice low enough only the wind could hear, he said, "It's starting." He reached into his coat, pulled out a sealed envelope, and placed it on his brother's grave. The envelope was plain, no markings, no initials, just a single crimson wax seal stamped with the crest of a lion wrapped in circuitry. A symbol few recognized, but those who did never forgot. Jalen placed it gently atop his brother's casket, then stepped back, eyes never leaving the soil. The man in black nodded subtly. Within seconds, a second figure emerged from the SUV, this one holding a steel briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. He approached without a word, unlocked the case, and retrieved a silver tablet with biometric encryption. One thumbprint, one scan, then the screen flickered to life. What displayed wasn't a tribute or slideshow. It was a ledger. A clean, time-stamped log of offshore wire transfers, encrypted communications, and boardroom decisions. Each line bore a signature, and at the bottom of every page was one name, Edward Langston. Jalen looked down, his voice barely audible. "You framed me with a paper trail you thought no one would ever find. But you forgot one thing. I built the system you used to bury me." In the upper floor of Langston Holdings' Ridgeport headquarters, the boardroom lights flickered. At the far end of the table, a notification blinked onto a secured screen. Priority alert, encrypted server breach, origin unknown. The room fell silent. Savannah Brooks, chief legal officer, leaned forward and tapped the screen. A single file opened. Inside, transaction logs, email chains, surveillance footage, names, dates, faces. Edward Langston's name was everywhere. And at the center of it all, Jalen Morris. "Is this real?" one director muttered. "It's time-stamped and authenticated," Savannah said, her voice cold tight. "This isn't a leak. This is a surgical drop." Another board member, older, more careful, adjusted his glasses. "He's not just exposing Edward. He's showing us he still controls the original architecture. The system we built to keep him out. It was his to begin with." Silence. Then a whisper. He never left. Across the city, inside his Bentley, Edward Langston's phone buzzed. He didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. He already knew what it meant. At precisely 4 p.m., inboxes across 4 major investment firms lit up with the same subject line. "For your due diligence." No agenda nama. No reply address. Just a download link, clean and verified. The contents? A 96-page dossier mapping Langston Holdings' hidden accounts, equity swaps, and shell companies tied to political contributions in 3 states. But what made it lethal wasn't the data. It was the certification seal, verified by Camden State University's Forensic Finance Lab, the same program Jalen had founded as a doctoral fellow 15 years earlier. One by one, inboxes went quiet. Phones started ringing. Legal teams were summoned. PR teams went offline. And in a penthouse suite overlooking downtown Ridgeport, an aging billionaire named Richard Langford, Edward's former mentor, held the dossier with trembling hands. "You said he was finished," he whispered. His assistant said nothing, just stared out the window. "Sir," she finally said, "this doesn't look like revenge." Her voice dropped. "It looks like succession." Miles Rennick was in the middle of a wine auction in Manhattan when his phone started vibrating nonstop. He ignored the first 3 calls. By the 4th, he stepped outside, annoyed, glass still in hand. "This better be good," he snapped. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, unfamiliar. "Mr. Rennick, we advise you to return home. Immediately." "Who is this?" he demanded. "Security detail?" The line went dead. At that moment, a server emerged from the gallery, carrying a thin envelope marked confidential. "For you, sir," she said, before disappearing without another word. Miles opened it. Inside was a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. Him, 15 years ago, in a Langston boardroom, standing beside Edward, smiling. In front of him, a contract with Jalen's name forged in black ink. Behind it, a bank transaction record. Offshore, unreported. His hands trembled. Beneath the photo, for words were typed in red. "I remember everything. J.M." Celeste Morgan hadn't spoken to the media in over a decade. After resigning from Langston Holdings just days after Jalen's arrest, she vanished. No LinkedIn, no press appearances, no trace. Some said she'd left the country. Others believed she'd taken a payout and disappeared for good. But in a quiet room overlooking the Bridgeview Community Library, she now sat facing 3 men in dark suits, each with questions they were suddenly afraid to ask. On the table before her was a slim black folder marked with the Zerani insignia, Jalen's former partner firm, presumed dissolved. Celeste opened it. Inside were names. Not just Edward Langston, not just Miles Rennick, but every board member who had signed off on the asset transfer directive that dismantled Jalen's stake and erased his voting rights. She looked up. Her voice was quiet, even. "These are not allegations. They're timestamps." One man swallowed. "Are you testifying?" Celeste closed the folder. "No," she said. "I'm co-signing." The quarterly board meeting of Langston Holdings was scheduled, as usual. 9 a.m. sharp, top floor conference hall, attendance mandatory. The directors arrived in tailored suits, clutching coffee cups and excuses, unaware that this meeting would not end like any before it. At 9:01, the double doors opened. And for the first time in 8 years, Jalen Morris stepped into the room. No security, no press, just him. The silence was immediate. Eyes widened. Coffee cups froze midair. Edward Langston, seated at the head of the table, stood halfway before stopping himself. "You're trespassing," he muttered. Jalen didn't blink. He placed a single USB drive on the center of the table. "This isn't a visit," he said calmly. "It's notice." Savannah Brooks reached for the drive, hand shaking. "What is this?" Jalen turned to her, once his fiercest critic, now barely breathing. "Proof of everything." He paused, and the motion for my reinstatement effective immediately. Then he looked Edward dead in the eye. "You're in my seat." For a moment, no one moved. The USB drive sat there like a lit fuse, small but impossible to ignore. Savannah inserted it into the projector port without a word. The screen on the wall came alive. Rows of documents, time-stamped footage, audio files with names. None of it was speculation. It was confession. Digital, legal, undeniable. One by one, board members shifted in their seats. Jalen didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. 8 years ago, he began, I walked into this room thinking intelligence and loyalty would be enough. He looked around, eyes locking with each person one by one. You taught me otherwise. His voice remained calm. You taught me how fragile truth becomes when power feels threatened, and how easy it is to trade justice for convenience. Edward shifted in his seat. Jalen didn't flinch. But what you failed to learn is that silence isn't surrender. It's strategy, and some storms don't pass. They wait. You stripped my name from the registry, Jalen continued. Erased my signature from patents I built, transferred my shares into silent accounts, hoping no one would notice. He glanced toward the end of the table where Miles Rennick used to sit. The chair was empty, and you called it business. He took a step closer to the screen, now displaying archived footage of board meetings spliced with wire transfers. What you never understood was that I never cared about the seed, he said. I cared about the structure, the foundation, the people we built this company for before greed rewrote our mission statement. A hush fell over the room. Some looked away. Others stared at the table, ashamed. Jalen's voice softened, but each word cut cleaner than before. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed every intern who believed merit mattered, every analyst who stayed late, every family who invested in a future we were supposed to build together. You thought it would end in noise, Jalen said quietly. A lawsuit, a headline, maybe a scandal to weather. He let the silence settle. But I wasn't interested in a spectacle. I was interested in precision. He nodded once. The projector screen shifted, now displaying an audit summary. Coded transfers, cross-border payments, offshore accounts linked directly to 2 former board members. This isn't revenge, he continued. It's accountability, and it's been documented, time-stamped, and notarized across 3 jurisdictions. One executive gasped. Another pushed back their chair slowly, like distance could protect them from what was coming. Jalen didn't look at them. His eyes stayed fixed on Edward Langston. You always said I didn't understand how the real world works, he said. But I listened. I learned. And while you buried evidence in vaults and hard drives, I built a truth that doesn't need lawyers to survive. He stepped back calm. It just needs sunlight. Jalen turned away from the screen and faced the room one last time. I'm not here to punish, he said, voice steady. I'm here to rebuild, but not with ghosts. He let that linger. Effective immediately, a new board will be appointed. One built not on favors, but on merit, on clarity, on purpose. Some lowered their eyes. Others nodded, quietly relieved. You're free to walk away, Jalen added. But know this, your silence, your signatures, your complicity, they're all recorded. And if you ever try to distort this story again, the world won't just remember what you did. It'll remember that I let you walk away. He took a breath. Not heavy, not angry, just clean, final. My name is Jalen Morris, he said, and I didn't come back for power. I came back for truth. Then he reached across the table, pulled Edward Langston's nameplate toward himself, and dropped it into the trash.